Morning, and thank you all for joining the call to present the issue paper and straw proposal for the Reliability Demand Response Resource Bidding Enhancements Initiative. This is Christina Osborne from ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'll be facilitating the meeting. So I just have a couple of housekeeping reminders. We are recording the call for informational and convenience purposes only. We'll post the video file out on the initiative webpage within a couple of days following the meeting. And just as a reminder to please request permission from the ISO before reprinting any related transcriptions. This meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. We do ask that you please keep your comments professional and respectful. And also, if you can try to be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said, that will help us manage the time more efficiently. We will break for questions throughout the presentation, so I'll provide instructions at that time for how to raise your hand. But just as a reminder, if you join via WebEx, you can select the hand icon above the chat window. If you just join via audio only, you'll need to press #2 on your phone to raise your hand. Please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment. And if you aren't able to raise your hand, you can also submit your question in the chat, to either myself or to all panelists, and I will read it out loud to the group and we'll respond. But I'll go over these instructions when we do break for questions. So this is the agenda. So Anya Gilbert and Danielle Table from the policy group will be presenting the material. So Anya will start with a review of the initiative background and scope. Danielle will then talk about the alignment of the real-time bidding rules with Ferc Order 831. Anya will discuss the minimum load cost and Rdr registration process, and then she'll go over our proposal for the EIM governing body's role for this initiative. And as I mentioned earlier, we are going to pause for questions throughout the presentation, but we did allocate some time at the end for additional questions. And then I'll go over the next steps for this initiative. So in addition to Anya and Danielle, we do have others from the ISO on the phone who are here to provide support for questions. Jill Powers, John Gooden, Bill Weaver, Kevin Head, Greg Ford, and Katie Wickler. You'll see them listed in the panelist window. So this graphic depicts the ISO stakeholder process. We are in the early stages of the policy development phase. We do have a more detailed schedule at the end of the presentation that we'll review. Okay, so at this time, I'll go ahead and turn the meeting over to Anya.
Great. Thank you, Christina. We can move to slide 7. So I'll start off by stating that the CAISO's goal with this initiative is to address stakeholder concerns as well as enhance the RDR representation in the market. It was really market participant questions and participation during the implementation of RDR enhancements adopted in the market enhancements for summer 2021, really highlighted the need for improvements to the RDR model as it relates to bidding rules under the Ferc Order 831 paradigm, representing minimum load costs, as well as Rdr registration. Next slide. So as a result of these concerns, this initiative is going to focus on aligning real-time bidding rules with Ferc Order 831, and I'll note here that it will be a separate stakeholder process in which the CAISO will kick off that will focus on developing a cost justification methodology for demand response. This will include RDRs participating economically in the day-ahead market, as well as energy storage resources bidding over $1,000. This initiative will also focus on representing minimum load costs and re-examining the cap on discrete Rdr registration. With that, I'll turn it over to Danielle to discuss real-time bidding alignment with Ferc Order 831.
Thanks, Anya. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I hope everyone's doing really well. Yeah, Anya introduced us at a very high level, but let's go ahead and move on to the next slide where we dive into more details. So to begin, I'll touch on a bit of background related to the Ferc Order 831 itself before diving into our proposal specific to RDRs. Back in 2016, Ferc issued Order 831 that raised the energy bid cap from $1,000 per megawatt hour to $2,000 and generally required suppliers that submit bids above $1,000 to base those bids on verifiable costs. Additionally, the order required that ISOs verify the costs underlying these cost-based bids above $1,000 per megawatt hour before a bid could be used to calculate energy prices. The CAISO made a compliance filing back in September 2019, and building on this, about a year ago, we undertook an initiative to comply with this Ferc order. And through an intensive stakeholder process, we developed multiple tariff revisions and system updates to comply and accommodate bidding flexibility above $1,000 per megawatt hour. And these changes and updates were approved by Ferc in February of this year and then implemented earlier this summer in June. If we move to the next slide, we'll dive into more details related to RDRR's bidding under the 831 paradigm. So currently, RDRRs in the real-time market are treated as emergency resources and are required to submit bids at least 95% of the soft energy bid cap, or $950 per megawatt hour. And keep in mind here that in the real time, RDRRs are released for dispatch only when a warning notice is issued by the operators. So under the 831 policy that we implemented earlier this summer, the bid cap is raised from $1,000 to $2,000 per megawatt hour only during periods when either of the following conditions exist. Either we have a submitted and cost verified bid from a resource-specific resource greater than $1,000 per megawatt hour, or the CAISO calculated maximum import bid price is greater than $1,000. This maximum import bid price is really designed to estimate the prevailing bilateral energy prices outside of the CAISO. Related to RDRRs, though, right now, when the bid cap is raised to 2,000, RDRR bids are still capped at 1,000 unless they submit a pre-market manual reference level change request that's based on higher operating costs or fuel costs. And this is based on our compliance filing that we made in September 2019, where we proposed that RDRRs would maintain their bidding structure by bidding at least 95% of the soft energy bid cap, even if the conditions mentioned above in this slide are met to raise the bid cap to 2,000. So if we move to the next slide, thank you. Related to our proposal, so we're to address the concerns that RDRRs are restricted from bidding greater than 1,000 when the energy bid cap is raised to 2,000, we're proposing the following bidding enhancements. So when the bid cap is 1,000, we're proposing to maintain the existing bidding structure for these resources, which means that they'll still be required in the real time to submit bids at or above 95% of the bid cap, or $950. Alternatively, when the bid cap is raised to 2,000 in the real time market, when RDRRs are considered emergency response resources, we're proposing to require these resources to submit bids at or above 95% of the hard bid cap, or at $1,900 per megawatt hour, without additional cost justification support. We think that this proposal is consistent with the intent of the RDRR settlement and the CAISO's RDRR design, which makes RDRRs available for dispatch only under emergency conditions when little supply is remaining. Without enabling RDRRs to bid close to the hard energy bid cap, RDRRs may end up suppressing real-time market prices during scarcity events, which would interfere with the economic signal the CAISO would otherwise send to supply. So I know there was a lot of information, so let me go ahead and pause here for some Q&A, see if there's any comments, feedback on the proposals. So operator, if you can go ahead and open up the lines, that'd be great.
So just as a reminder, if you logged into WebEx, you can select the hand icon above the chat window, above on the right, or if you just dialed into the meeting, press #2. You're also welcome to send your questions in the chat to either myself to either me or the panelists. We'll just give it a moment.
All right, we do have some hands raised so far. We'll go ahead and move to the first one. Line's being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of California Large Energy Consumers Association, otherwise known as CLECA. Just a quick sound check, make sure people can hear me.
Yes, thank you, Paul.
Excellent. So I've got two questions at this point. One, can you go back to, I think it's slide 11, and you were talking RDR and higher operating or fuel costs associated. That kind of confused me a bit, since there isn't strictly really a fuel cost associated with demand response.
Yeah, Paul, thank you for the question. You know what, I think I've got some of the internal team on the line that I think will help answer this question. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie. Hopefully she can help address this.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Paul, for your question. I think the concept we're getting at here, and maybe this should say fuel equivalent costs instead of fuel costs, you know, understanding that DR resources don't technically have natural gas underlying fuel costs. So I think the idea here is that, you know, the pre-market reference level change request would be based on, you know, the higher operating costs or what we consider to be fuel equivalent costs. So that might be a typo in the slide.
And again, the issue of higher operating cost, I mean, you know, at least for the industrial customers, it's the lost value, you know, when they are triggered, you know, there's lost, you know, product. So I'm not sure exactly how you're defining operating in this as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we could also consider this as opportunity costs. As Anya mentioned previously, we are exploring these costs in a separate initiative. So that initiative is kind of going to dive into more of the underlying costs, whether they're operating opportunity costs for DR resources. So that'll be handled in a separate stakeholder process.
So my second question is, can you walk through more detail the timing of when you actually then decide that the bid cap is raised to 2,000, and how that, and I guess what's the sort of the process for then people to resubmit bids?
Sure, I can speak to that, Paul. I think that's a good question. So the bid cap can be raised in the day-ahead market to $2,000. And when that happens, all hours corresponding to the hours when those conditions exist to raise the bid cap to $2,000 in the day ahead, all of those hours corresponding to the real-time market, the bid cap would be raised to 2,000.
So that would be after the day-ahead market results are published, or before the bids are due? Before
the bids are due.
Okay.
Alternatively, we could also run into a scenario where if costs are not greater than $1,000 in the day-ahead market, but costs rise to be above $1,000 in the real-time market, then in the real-time market, we would raise the bid cap to $2,000. And we recognize that, you know, that's a really tight timeline for suppliers. So there's a section in the issue paper straw proposal on page 5 where we talk about how it's illustrated in the business practice manual for market instruments that we would communicate to scheduling coordinators through Cyber, the bidding platform, when the energy bid cap is raised to 2,000 for each hour of the day. So scheduling coordinators will have the opportunity to revise their bids to reflect the change in bid cap. But like I said, there are tight time constraints in the real-time market, so it's really not feasible for us to keep that bidding window open past the typical real-time market close for each hour. So that allows about 30 minutes for scheduling coordinators to go ahead and revise their bids based on the increase in the bid cap.
My apologies. I had some technical glitch, and I think I missed about half of your explanation.
No problem, Paul. You know what, I think for the sake of time, and I know there's quite a few other questions in the queue, there's a paragraph on page 5 of the issue paper straw proposal that I think gets to your question related to how the CAISA will communicate to scheduling coordinators through cyber when the bid cap has been raised. And feel free to reach out additional questions.
I guess let's try to distill, I think the issue is, in real time, when you change the bid cap, how long do people then have to update their bids? I think that's the critical issue.
So that timeline is about 30 minutes.
30 minutes, okay. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, moving to the next caller in the queue. Your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Alva Svoboda from PG&E. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Alva.
Hey, thank you. I'm actually going to follow up on Paul's questions a little bit because we had some concerns about the implementation of this. It appears that the concern is that when the bid cap is changed, the RDRR bids that are currently in the system would become invalid. And so it's not just a matter of a tight timeline, it's a matter of there's a forced change of the bids at that point, which is not currently part of the process for RDRR or for any bids that are in the real-time market. So we do have a concern about that aspect of this. Also, I would say in terms of the timing, based on you're currently publishing the update of the bid caps, and it appears to be a lot tighter than what you're saying in terms of what's currently being published in the messages on cyber. The timestamp, now it could be that they're not actually being changed according to the timestamp, but the timestamp of the last update to the bid cap is right before the deadline for the real-time bids to be put into the market. So there's no half hour visible in the current way these updated bid caps are being published to the system. So we have some concerns about that. I just wanted to express that both the fact that we have difficulty with the concept of having to update a bid in real time on that kind of timeline, and then possibly that there might be it might be even tighter than you're suggesting in terms of how the systems are currently working. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alva. I appreciate the comments and feedback. I'll encourage you to put that into your formal written comments so we can include looking into that as part of the next version of the proposal.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, moving to the next caller in the queue. Your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Danielle, it's Mark Smith of Calpine. Just following up on those earlier two comments. So is there going to be a cyber rule that rejects bids that are at 950 instead of 1900 for those hours where the bid cap goes up to 2000? And if so, how will scheduling coordinators be notified?
Thanks, Mark, for your question. You know, it's something that we briefly talked about internally, but, you know, this is just the issue paper straw proposal. So we felt like it was pretty early on in the stakeholder process to really flesh out all of those implementation details, and we wanted to provide stakeholders the opportunity to help, you know, provide feedback on what they would like to see and the concerns that they have before we flesh those out even farther. So like I mentioned to Alva, I'll encourage you to illustrate your concerns and any potential solutions you have to mitigate those in your comments, and we'll incorporate those in the next proposal.
Okay, thanks, Danielle. I'll just add that, you know, I'm surprised that this isn't already the case based on the Ferc order and based on your own tariff that says you bid at 95% of the cap. I guess it's 95% of the soft cap, which is more particular. Is that the case? So that's why you have to make this change?
I think right now it's a bit of a gap in the policy where the compliance filing that we issued in September 2019 was very specific to RDRR's bidding at 95% of the soft cap. And so I think there's a tariff change that can be made to accommodate RDRR's bidding when the bid cap is raised to 2,000. I'll let Greg Ford, answer if he has anything else to add as well. Don't forget to mute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I did forget. Hey, this is Greg Ford with the IT department. I just, regarding the comments about the timing of the cyber rules, yes, those are valid concerns. I have those too, and I would like to hear feedback in the comments about what stakeholders prefer. We have choices of either, we could, accept the bids as they were validated, meaning that there could be a set of bids that are coming in at between 950 and 1,000, and let those go to the market. We could reject those, after the bid cap goes from 1,000 to 2,000, but then that means there's a potential that bids don't get to the market that the ISO needs. And then there's a third, there's another option is where we any bids that are compliant with the new minimum limit will be somehow raised so that they are in compliance with the limit. Those are the three options I can think of, and if you have opinions on those, I'd appreciate those. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we do not have any additional questions in the queue at this time. Actually, I do see another question on the phone line.
Okay.
Caller, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is excuse me, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Hey, Kathleen. Yep, we can hear you.
Great. I wanted to make a couple comments. I think there are two issues that I believe you're raising. One that we've been focusing on, which is what the reference level adjustment is for demand response resources and what the 831 implementation was intended for these types of resources versus a question of whether or not, even regardless of that, if a scarcity like price value should be associated with these RDRR offers when they are released by the operators, so that if hit, we can be ensured those scarcity like prices are reflected in the LMP formation. I think these are two separate issues. So let me speak to the first one first. I did want to just kind of remind everyone it's been years and it's been a long time, but commitment cost and default energy bid enhancements was a project that was launched in order to do the implementation of Ferc Order 831. The discussion on what the CAISO's policy is for demand response resources offers above the $1,000 soft cap are included in this project. Just as a reminder, it is included on page 40 and page 41 of the second revised draft final proposal. On page 40, the CAISO has their last policy that has been approved by the board. I believe it was approved in March of 2018 in that board memo that was taken up to the Board of Governors. The policy at the time that was approved that I believe that you're intending to revise, and so I do have a request that the next iteration clearly specify what is the reigning policy and what you're trying to change. And that way we can track it as a stakeholder community. Not everyone has the level of painful memory that I think I do of that project. So it would be very helpful for the stakeholder community if when you do your next iteration, you summarize what CCW's policy was for DR cost offers under 831, as well as RDRR. There's a section for that as well. And what you would like to revise from that existing policy that is board approved. The policy to kind of crowdsource. For demand response, the intent, we understood how difficult it was going to be to create a reference level, to create a reasonableness threshold that could be used in real time to allow those offers, those reference level adjustments, to go through into the market because of a lack of transparency into the opportunity cost that demand response resources have. I did also want to make sure that everyone is aware, because I heard Katie say opportunity costs. There's different kinds of opportunity costs. The Ferc Order 831 filings clarified that for demand response resources, it is customer opportunity cost that is most likely to have the highest value, highest cost within a DR resource. If you look at the CCW second revised draft final proposal, you'll see that described in there as the CAISO's policy is that demand response resources, reference level adjustments, be able to reflect that customer opportunity cost. Customer opportunity cost is defined by the CAISO as customer opportunity cost associated with foregoing whatever end use the energy would have been used for. I recognize that that is a difficult challenge, and we knew that at the time that we were working on the implementation that your group, Quality and Renewable Integration, had to implement. And so the intent at the time was that a demand response resource would submit the reference level adjustment request. It would be subject to ex-ante review, just like all other generating resources. That is also in the policy. So able to be submitted, haircut to whatever the reasonableness threshold was, and then that reference level adjustment request would then be passed through to your after-the-fact review. During the after-the-fact review, you would have the ability to have detailed conversations with that entity that submitted that request to get their support and have them provide and explain to you how they value their customer opportunity cost. It was understood at the time that there was a trade-off, that it would not be, that adjustment may not be reflected in price formation above this $1,000 soft energy offer cap, but that it would be eligible for after-the-fact cost recovery. And that's why I want to make up there's two different things going on. That was the judgment that was made at the time. So I think the issue that you're raising here is whether or not that is appropriate, or whether scarcity pricing like value should be the price that it's reflected at, regardless of if it's able to verify those costs. And I really encourage you to reach out to me, and I'm happy to help you with this project. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Kathleen. Did you have a question, or otherwise, we do encourage you to submit this in writing as well.
I just wanted to remind everyone and crowdsource so everyone was on the same page.
Great.
Thanks for the comments, Kathleen. I think it's helpful to encourage these comments, but we are going to open up a separate initiative that's more appropriate. That's a more appropriate venue for, I think, majority of your comments. So we'll definitely be reaching out to you. But yeah, like Christina said, we encourage you to illustrate your comments in written comments.
Looks like we have one more question.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Adam, do we have somebody else in the queue? It looks like Paul Nelson's back in the queue.
We do.
Okay.
And Paul, you're now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson again on behalf of CLECA. Sorry, I didn't catch the person's name. I think it was from the IT that mentioned 3 possible solutions on sort of this bidding issues when the bid cap gets changed. I think it would be helpful if you could distribute that, so if you can get feedback from parties. I tried to write them all down, but I don't know if I got it successfully, so I think that would be helpful. I think what I'm about to offer is sort of as a twist, I think, on the third one, which is, since the tariff is a 95% or greater above the bid cap, perhaps for RDRR, instead of bidding in a megawatt, you bid as a percentage of the bid cap, so that if you automatically change the bid cap, then all these bids then would be automatically adjusted. That would certainly make things easier for perhaps for a lot of people. Of course, that depends on how their systems, enter stuff into the CAISO. But I offer up that as a sort of perhaps I don't know if that's a third modification of a third one, or is that a fourth one? So.
Thanks, Paul, for your comments. I think those are really valuable, and we'll look forward to reading more about them in your written feedback.
Yeah, but can you commit to perhaps distributing the other three solutions that were offered for people to give you feedback on? I think that would be helpful.
You know, I think it's worth putting into the next version of the paper, but we can also consider adding them into the comments template to allow stakeholders to opine on them and start thinking about them offline.
Okay.
All right, go on to the next caller in the queue.
Okay.
Line is now muted. Please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Josh Arnold, PG&E. I'd actually like to second that request, and I think putting the IT paths, the three possible solution paths, into the comments would actually be incredibly beneficial, because I'm under-caffeinated right now, and I know I'm not going to remember all three when it comes time to write our comments. So if you could do that, that would be really very useful. Thank you.
All right, no problem. Thanks.
Any other questions, Adam?
We do not have any additional questions in the queue at this time.
Great. I don't see anything in the chat, so we can go ahead and move on.
All right. Well, thank you, Christina, and thanks, Danielle. So I'll start out by stating that CAISO framed this as an issue paper and straw proposal, and both of the upcoming topics are more in the issue paper phase. You can move to the next slide. So the CAISO and its Summer Readiness Initiative modified its tariff to dispatch RDRs during real-time unit commitment so that they could be optimally dispatched within a longer horizon in order to increase the efficiency of market dispatch. Summer Readiness also created new bidding options to define RDR as 60-minute or 15 minutes to better reflect RDR's operational capabilities. The changes also allowed RDR to set the market clearing price in the 15-minute market and was intended to reduce the occurrence of RDRs being dispatched due to variations in forecasts between the 15-minute and 5-minute market. In light of the changes made to RDR and Summer Readiness with additional bidding options, the market optimization is now able to do a further lookout for RDR resources, which also makes them more likely to be dispatched by the market rather than be exceptionally dispatched. Next slide. So now that RDR has a longer look ahead, resources are more likely to be committed and specifically viewed as available and committed to their PMIN as a result of not having commitment costs. To review some relevant terms and current rules for RDR, minimum load is the generator or RDR resource's minimum sustained operating level at which it can operate continuously. Minimum load cost is the cost per hour for a resource to operate and provide energy at its minimum load. Currently, RDRs are required to register a $0 minimum load cost in the master file, and currently it's RDR's 1 startup per day that's used to get to the resource's PMIN. So RDR's inability to register a non-zero minimum load cost means that there are varying impacts based on what their PMIN is registered as. When the PMIN of an RDR is registered as 0, there may be an infeasible dispatch from the RDR program capability perspective, not necessarily the market perspective. From the market perspective, they are available between their PMIN and PMAX for their daily maximum runtime. When the PMIN of an RDR resource is near the resource's PMAX, the resource could be committed to the resource's PMIN. Next slide. In light of these challenges, CAISO would like to hear from stakeholders and comments what their minimum load cost may be and recommendations they have for representing them in the market. Some of these questions relate to, do RDRs have actual minimum load costs from either a physical and or program perspective? If so, do stakeholders have proposals for calculating their minimum load costs? If there was a default RDR minimum load costs, are there recommendations stakeholders have on how those default costs should be calculated? Do stakeholders believe that these costs should be included? And do any of these answers vary based on if the resource is bidding economically in the day ahead or bidding in real time? So with that, I'll open it up to questions on minimum load costs.
Okay, I'm not sure if Alva I think Alva has his hand raised up, but just as a reminder, if you're logged into WebEx, you can click on the hand icon above the chat window, or if you just dialed in, you can press #2. So we'll go ahead and go to Alva.
Hello. I've got to remember to put my hand down so that I think I clicked on it, but I didn't put it down the last time. So thank you.
Okay, no problem.
No, I did have it up though. So I actually wanted to make raise a couple of issues. I think the way that you're talking about this in terms of putting things into the comments template is a really good approach. So the two things I wanted to mention were, one, PG&E had brought up the concept of a minimum load cost for just DR in general several years ago, and in fact there was an informal commitment to implement something of the sort, and it was not possible to do. So you might, or at least the ISO was not able to fit it into the implementation plan. So you might want to look at what the obstacles were to that, because it would seem that if it sort of could be implemented, it probably should be implemented more broadly than just RDRR. And that brings me to my second point, which is that there have been a lot of discussion recently in the context of batteries about the difficulties of capturing longer horizons in the real-time markets, which is where RDRR is primarily, implemented. I credit you for raising the issue of the possible day-ahead use as well, but in general, RDRR meant to be a real-time resource. And in that real-time setting, a minimum load cost may not be properly, even if you can justify it and put it into the system, it may not be properly optimized around in the kinds of horizons you're using in the real-time market. I mean, you're basically talking about a commitment cost, and your horizon may not include even the length of a feasible RDRR dispatch. So those are areas I would have concerns about in implementing something like this, that you'd actually be able to guarantee that if a minimum load cost were entered, it would be used correctly in the real-time markets. And also just whether we should be considering this more broadly. Thank you.
Alva.
All right, moving to the next person in the queue. All right, Paul, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA. The first bullet here is kind of from a minimum load cost from a physical appropriateness perspective. I mean, it seems to kind of like thinking like DR is like a generation source that can have very distinct minimum load, cost differences between minimum load and maximum load, which I'm not sure really exists for DR. And then also reflected, these are emergency programs, and typically when they get called, it's we want you to drop all your load and we want you to do it as soon as possible. So there tends to be less need for this granularity, though I think we're going to get to discrete in the future. But if this is really trying to put in a minimum load cost to solve the optimization and dispatch problems, then I think you really need to think about this as from the aspect of what value is needed to resolve the dispatch problems, and not necessarily looking at the minimum load cost from how you consider it for like a generation resource. Because that's what you're trying to achieve here, is trying to resolve issues with the dispatch.
Paul, this is John Gooden. We need to understand, particularly for that unique flavor of RDR that is participating day ahead economically, which makes it like any other competitively bid resource. How do those costs, i.e. minimum load, if an RDRR that's bidding economically and day ahead wants to have those commitment costs, how are those reflected, justified because those costs add cost to the system, and so they need to be somehow justified as to what they are. So I get it for the emergency, but there is this scenario of the day-ahead economically bid at RDRR. We need to understand those costs, those commitment costs.
And so what you're saying that within a program, there's a curve. Because this is really coming down to, a day ahead. It's what does the customer want for compensation to drop load? And what you're saying is a difference between there's a cost difference between minimum and maximum, is what you're suggesting.
Yeah, and if there truly isn't a minimum load for an economically bid RDRR, then those costs should just be reflected in the bid, the energy bid. But if there truly are a minimum load cost, like I have to take this pump off before I can actually get to the load that I'm going to drop, or I have to take this motor off first before I can get, do this first before I can do that. Those become sort of those physical realities of the equivalent of a minimum load. I have to remove this before I can actually give you the demand response, the full demand response. We need to understand those sort of physical realities of commitment costs and minimum load.
Yeah, and then there's also not necessarily where you take down half a process and keep going the other. It's once you start the path of shutting things down. It's there are in an industrial process there can be a sequence, but it also means they're all linked together and you start shutting down the entire process. So it's definitely different than a thermal generation or other generation.
Yeah, and that scenario sounds more like, it's either on or off, not necessarily a minimum load type of physical scenario. So that's what we need to understand.
Any other questions, Paul?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have one more in the queue.
All right. Moving to the next person in the queue. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, it's Mark with Calpine again. Sorry, just as the gardeners have started up their blowers. The changes that you made last June really were, I think you labeled those as scarcity pricing changes, trying to get RDRR more into the price formation scheme by allowing them to set LMPs. Establishing min load characteristics for this kind of demand response seems to be moving in the opposite direction. Because in fact, the min load costs, especially under a scenario where Pmin is approaching Pmax, min load costs don't find their way into LMPs in your current market design. So I think that this change in assigning minimum loads and minimum load costs to demand response needs to be reviewed really, really carefully and maybe skeptically in order to make sure that these things do indeed accomplish the goals that you set forward in June, and that is to be able to set price. We'll put some of this in our comments, but I just thought it was worth saying it here as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, that'd be helpful to have in comments, and I think to your point and Alva's, it'd be helpful for us to produce some examples to walk through what some of those impacts might look like. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
We do have an additional caller in the queue. Your line is being muted. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I forgot to lower my hand last time. My bad.
No worries. We do have a comment on the phone line, or at least we did. Alrighty. Caller on the phone, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks. This is Kathleen Goldberg from Vistra again. I'm similarly to some of the other callers trying to make sure that I understand the problem that we're trying to solve. I'm with Mark that the last item we were talking about, to me, was about scarcity price changes. This item, I think I'm hearing that you're raising an issue with the way that RDRRs are being dispatched, but I'm also hearing that this is a DR-wide issue, both PDR and RDRR. So my first question is, can you clarify if this element is for all DR, PDR, and RDRR, please?
This is for RDRR.
Okay, that is helpful. I would just reemphasize that I think if the issue that I heard John articulate was there are minimum load costs that a DR resource can have, what's the basis for evaluating those is a demand response wide question. I think I know I'm with Paul Nelson from CLICA in his comment that when we're talking about RDR specific use, those types of programs, the way that RDR is deployed and used, I think it does raise some questions of if min load cost is really furthering the intent of that program's dispatch intent for those resources. So encourage you to think about that more. But staying on the idea of just demand response minimum load cost for both PDR and RDRR, because what John said made a ton of sense, right? You have there's the possibility for a min-gen amount for DR. You can register it in master file today, and you can register the minimum load cost today for at least PDR when you look at the network and resource modeling GRDT definition station rules. So my question for you is, and this may be more for John, this would be really helpful for, I think, the broader group, is the problem statement here that you can register these values in master file, but that the master file team would appreciate having some bright lines for how they should be validating that field. Is that the problem statement?
Now, the problem statement is this, is that just as you said, PDR is allowed to have commitment costs, but RDR is not. It's not allowed. And so that's part of what we're discussing here is allowing RDR to have these commitment costs, these min load costs, and when is it appropriate and how is it justified? That's already, like I said, that's already always been the case for PDR, never for RDR. So that's why we're talking about it here. And I think it's important to understand that the nature that I think a lot of people don't understand is that why does RDRR, that we all think about as an emergency DR product only, why does it have this attribute of being able to participate day ahead economically? And that's because RDRR resources can have dual participation in a retail program. They can be in an economic program, utility program day ahead, and also be enrolled in the base interruptible program as an emergency resource. So RDRR from its inception had to accommodate this dual nature of RDRR. And that's why, you know, it makes this challenging, because in day ahead it looks a lot like a PDR, but was never allowed to have commitment costs. In real time, it is and must be an emergency response resource for anything above and beyond what was committed day ahead. So hopefully that shines light and provides some better understanding for folks as to why there is this dual nature of RDRR.
I think it does, and I think, you know, and thank you so much for going through that wealth of knowledge. It's really helpful. And I think that is very helpful. So the way that I think, at least I'll take it back and encourage you to think if there's a way to kind of make this clear in your future discussions, but is that for this, we're talking about removing the restriction on registering the min load cost for RDRR in master file, adopting some types of evaluation heuristics or concepts for that would apply to any DR resource, and then whether or not there should be a difference between the day ahead and real time procedures of how that's reflected in the market because of the dual kind of I'm hearing and taken away. So thank you.
Any other questions?
We do not have any additional questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay. go ahead and move on. Hold on one second. I'm having trouble advancing the slide, Adam. I'm not sure if my screen is frozen.
Do you want me to give it a try?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that'd be great. Oh, never mind. I see it. Good.
Oh, whoops, I just may give you the presenting rights back.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, Rdr registration, RDRR.
All right, thanks, Christina. We can move to the next slide.
Sure.
Thanks. So this next and last issue is with RDR registration. There are currently two registration options, either discrete or continuous. Discrete indicates the resource has one bid segment and when dispatched will generate to its PMAX. Discrete registration is also currently capped at 50 megawatts due to previous technology limitations of the CAISO. Continuous or non-discrete registration indicates that a resource can operate between its PMIN and PMAX based on the cleared bid quantity similar to other resources. Along these lines, the CAISO has received stakeholder feedback that some RDRRs operate together in one sublap, but due to the 50 megawatt cap are forced to be represented separately. We've heard that this representation can cause challenges for RDR resources in terms of operating their programs effectively. And you can move to the next slide. And in light of these challenges, we're raising the question, if a revision to the discrete cap of RDRR to a higher threshold would increase the number of RDR megawatts using the discrete option and would best reflect RDRR resources. With that, I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, again, you can use either the raise hand icon above the chat window, or if you're on the phone, press #2. Or you can also send your question in the chat. Give it a moment.
All right, we do have someone in the queue.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, it's Marco Calpine one more time. Is there a price formation difference between these two options? In other words, is it discrete movement from, say, 0 to PMAX? Does that affect price in any way? I assume the continuous does. Can you review that for me, or is that just a question that can come into maybe the text of an issue paper?
Or if somebody's responding, you'll need to unmute your phone.
Sure, maybe just a question from the team, maybe Greg, if you could discuss the price formation aspect, or otherwise, I think Mark will have to get back to you on that.
Yeah, hi, this is Greg. I think we'll have to get back to you on that. I don't remember how the discrete option currently works off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks. I'll ask the question in comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. All right. Anybody else in the queue?
Mark, did you mean to put yourself back in the queue?
No, I meant to lower my hand. Sorry.
No worries. I do not think we have any additional people in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay, I don't see any chat questions. All right, EIM governing body role. Anya?
Sure. So in this initiative, the EIM governing body will have joint authority on the RDR bidding enhancements. We recognize that EIM balancing authority areas may use the RDR model, assuming that they have approval from their local regulatory authority and if they meet the requirements of RDR participation. In light of the EIM governing body charter and in light of the three elements kind of being applicable to EIM entity balancing authority areas and the entities and market participants, we are viewing this as a joint authority option. But if there are any comments or questions on this, stakeholders are encouraged to submit their response to this EIM classification. Next slide. With that, we can open it up to Q&A on any of the elements. I do see a question from Paul.
All right, Paul, go ahead.
This is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLICA. So on this governing body issue, are there any EIM entities using the RDR bidding option at this point?
There are not any EIM entities using RDRR today, but EIM entities are not precluded from using the RDRR model.
Okay.
All right, and I do not think we have any additional people in the verbal queue at this time.
And I don't see any chat questions. So just one more opportunity if you have any questions about any of the information we presented today. All right, well, I'll go over next steps. If you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a detailed schedule of the initiative. I'm not going to go through it line by line. I will point out that we are asking you to submit your written comments by November 12th. We will have a comments template available for you out on the initial webpage. And then the next step will be to publish a revised draft proposal in early December. And then we are looking to take this proposal to the EIM governing body February 2022, and then to the ISO board in March 2022. So any questions on the schedule? And this is just a link to the initial webpage where you can find the comments template.
I do not think we have any verbal questions in the queue at this time.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much for participating today. Again, we do encourage you to, the comments that we heard today, if you can submit those in writing by end of day November 12th. We did record the call today, so we will post the video file shortly after we receive it from the vendor out on the initial webpage. So any final comments from the ISO staff or any questions? All right. Well, thank you again.
Comments or questions? Just thank you for attending.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, no problem. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Look forward to your comments.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes your webinar. Thank you for using Event Services, and you may now disconnect.